Thanks for joining us on The Place for History on the KY3 Digital Desk. We're joined by Clay Bowski, and Clay is retiring after 40 years of service as the curator of the Truman Library. And first of all, congratulations. And
Thank you.
I'll start with the big question. What are the most dramatic changes you've seen there at the Truman Library in your time? 40 years.
40 years. Well, I think if I were to look at the entire 40 years, the big thing, I mean, there were two things. There's been the sort of the shift in the interpretation of Harry Truman and his presidency over the years. But on the sort of the micro level at the museum, it's sort of the transformation from our records being all physical and paper records and so forth to digitizing materials and making it available on our website, and so that people around the country, even without coming to the Truman Library, can learn a lot about Truman and look at a lot of the original records through the website. So those are kind of the two main things. And I, as the museum curator, I'm in charge of the exhibits we have in our museum. And there have been a lot of changes in that area as well over the years.
Well, describe some of those changes. The museum went through a renovation just a couple of years ago, pretty major renovation.
Yeah, we did. We actually did most of the actual physical construction of the new exhibits during COVID. So our museum was actually closed because of COVID, but we were able to have construction crews in there and doing the new exhibits. So we kind of, the public was not inconvenienced too much because they wouldn't have been able to come to the library anyway. But we did a major $30 million total renovation of our museum exhibits that reopened in the middle of 2021. And we sort of reimagined the entire museum and took another look at the Truman story. We had done a major renovation at the turn of the century, about 2001. But the technology in the museum was not up to snuff anymore. Mm-hmm. And we got a new director about 8 years ago. And he and I talked, and we decided, he decided, well, let's do the whole thing over again. So we just started from scratch, reimagined the entire museum. And since we had done our last renovation in 2000 and 2001, we also had a lot of new material in our collections that we could access, both archival and museum collections. So we just reimagined the entire museum, did a complete, had a great design team from our staff. We spent a couple of years actually just thinking about what is it in our collection that we really want to highlight. We tried to get those things out. We tried to retell the Truman story so that it was sort of more accessible to younger audiences who, as far as a lot of the younger people today, Harry Truman might as well have been living in the same time as Julius Caesar. So we had to do the exhibits in context to what was going on at the time when Harry Truman was president, and how did his policies affect not only the time then, but going forward, a lot of the same issues that he dealt with then we're still dealing with today.
Well, a curator, if you don't mind my interpretation, is a bit like a storyteller. So which exhibit at the museum, the library, best tells Truman's story and has your particular fingerprint really on it?
Yeah. Well, I think that's sort of our new renovation. Our new permanent, we call them permanent exhibits. No exhibits are permanent, but they're the exhibits you can expect to see when you go back and revisit the museum. But that would be the main thing. As I just mentioned before, today when you do exhibits on a historical figure, you have to put it in a context so that people who weren't around at the time will know what was the environment in which this person lived. And to us, sort of the key thing was trying to provide what we call a hook, that moment in time when you can really identify the key moment in our case, Harry Truman's life. And that was in April of 1945, when Truman, who had only been vice president for 82 days and had only met with President Franklin Roosevelt twice alone, Truman suddenly becomes president when Franklin Roosevelt dies suddenly. And it's in the middle of World War II, so there's fighting going on in Europe and in Asia, all around the world. Um, and this is the environment in which Truman is thrust. And he really wasn't a part of the administration. He wasn't, as I said, he only met with Roosevelt twice as vice president. And so Truman is put in this position of, what do we do now? He's suddenly in charge of everything, and he doesn't really know a lot about what has been going on. So the question that we pose a question at the beginning of the exhibit, when Harry Truman first becomes president, what is it in his past that built his character to the point where he could take on the presidency? And so we use that theme throughout the rest of the exhibit as we tell his story, his life story. We try to develop those key themes that built his character and made it possible for him to actually take over the presidency on Roosevelt's death.
On the other end, Truman ended his presidency not really well liked, and it does seem like history has been kind to him in my interpretation. Is that what you've noticed?
No, that's exactly right. When Truman left office, he actually had the lowest approval rating of any president, even up to the present. His approval rating was in the 20% when he left the presidency. And that was largely because at the time we were embroiled in the Korean War, and it had stalemated, and there didn't seem to be a conclusion coming out of the Korean War. So people were just tired. And so that's what Truman's reputation was when he left office. But then when he died in 1972, and just a couple of years after that, Richard Nixon had to resign from office because of the Watergate scandal. And that really made people start thinking, well, if Harry Truman had been president, he never would have been caught in this mess. And it sort of spoke to his character as a person. And that started to raise his reputation. And then, of course, one of the big things was in the mid 80s, David McCullough wrote his terrific biography of Harry Truman. And it was a very popular book, and people came to, reconnect with Truman, and that's his popularity went up after that. And ever since, he's been rated probably everywhere from about 5th to 6th or 7th of the best presidents.
I grew up in Missouri, and of course, growing up in Missouri, you learn about Truman, or at least you did back in my school days. And I do remember the McCullough book. It came out, and I grabbed a copy, read it myself, and it seemed to cement in the public's mind, because I believe there was a movie based on that too.
Yes.
This is the buck stops here guy. Did that book, and you talked about 1972 and Nixon, did that book really cement this character, this moral character persona in the public eye?
I think it really did, yes. And I think you put it well when you said he's the buck stops here guy. That's one of the centerpieces, one of the sort of key artifacts in our museum is the original buck stops here sign that Truman had, and he kept referring to it. He said, and what it meant, of course, was the president has to make the tough decisions, and he can't blame anybody else for the decisions. So the buck stops with him. And I think people really sort of latched on to that idea and knew that Truman made tough decisions, and once he had made them, he stuck with them, and he had very few regrets about the decisions he made. Now, looking back in hindsight, there are a lot of issues that Truman dealt with that are still affecting us today for both good and bad. One of the ones in the news right now, in particular, is NATO,
Mm-hmm.
the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that involves the war in Ukraine. Um, and of course, NATO was formed during Truman's administration. Another issue, Israel was founded during Truman's administration, and the United States was the first country to recognize Israel. And of course, there's so much happening in Israel right now as well. The United Nations was founded during Truman's administration, and it's almost daily you can see sort of the controversies, the good news and the bad news, the controversies revolving around what the United Nations does around the world. So there are a lot of issues that originated in Truman's administration that we're still dealing with today.
Yeah, one thing Truman did was stand up to the Soviet Union after World War II, at the end of World War II. And he came along with the Truman Doctrine. And it seems like these days it's the first time some politicians want to go away from that doctrine of standing up to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's true. And the Truman Doctrine was obviously named for Truman, but it was to provide aid to Greece and Turkey to help prevent their nations from going under to communism. It was followed up with the Marshall Plan, which was a massive program to help rehabilitate Europe after World War II. And today, another thing that's in the news is, there's the whole controversy about whether or not foreign aid that the United States spends is worth spending around the world. So there's so many of these issues are just in the news today. And Truman was very much an internationalist. That you can just see that in the founding of NATO and the United Nations and programs like the Marshall Plan. And there's real debate going on in Congress right now about whether or not we want to continue being internationalists or whether we kind of shrink back and be more a nationalist country.
Which one of Truman's decisions seemed to get the least attention and really deserves more attention? We've touched on a number of them.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, some of the obvious decision points are the decision to use the atomic bomb at the end of the war. Mm-hmm. Truman always felt that his most difficult decision was the decision to go into the Korean War. But I would say, you mentioned kind of least recognized decisions. I would think probably in 1948, he issued two executive orders. One was an executive order that desegregated the armed forces. And that has, over time, has had a tremendous effect on the armed force, not only the armed forces, but also was one of the first real positive actions leading towards the later civil rights movement and a lot of the actions that happened during the Johnson administration, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and so forth. Truman also issued an executive order desegregating the federal government, so it had the same effect. So his actions on civil rights, which were not easy back then, because in the context of the times, the Democratic Party back then was a coalition of sort of liberal northern politicians, and also the Southern Democrats were segregationists, and they had real power in Congress. They had a lot of leadership in Congress. So it was a very diverse party, and tried to hold the pieces of the party together. And in 1948, when Truman ran for re-election, they had actually split the Democratic Party, and a good chunk of Southern Democrats left the party and really never came back. So the whole issue of civil rights, I think, during Truman's administration is one thing that I think is overlooked a lot because it's overshadowed by so many of his international decisions.
So tremendous pushback from not only his own party, but the military too. It's my understanding the military didn't go desegregate the next day.
No, that's absolutely correct. He signed the order in 1950, and excuse me, 1948, and really it wasn't. There was a lot of resistance to it in the military, but essentially by the end of the Korean War, which was at the end of Truman's administration, finally the military was being desegregated. So it took a long time with a lot of resistance.
So you are in your final days of service at the library. What's your hope for the person who succeeds you?
Well, I think the challenge is to keep telling the story about how relevant Truman's presidency and the many decisions he had to make, how relevant those are for today. Now, I'm assuming, well, I'm sure whoever replaces me is going to be much younger than me. So they're probably more in tune to the younger generation than I am. But just spreading the word about how critical the Truman presidency came at a most critical time in world history. The world had just came out of World War II. Nations around the world had collapsed financially, and Truman had to basically reshape the world order because the United States was one of the very few countries that came out of World War II actually richer than it was when it went into the war. And so it was a classic example of really for a while, the United States was really by far the dominant power in the entire world. And so the decisions Truman made had a real effect all around the world.
Clay, I want to thank you for joining us on The Place for History on the KY3 Digital Desk. Happy trails, I guess, is the thing you say?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.